Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. This morning, the Supreme Court stayed what the press calls Arvind Kejriwal's gag order. In doing so, the court appeared to accuse Mr. Kejriwal of double standards and hypocrisy. So in part two, we ask how embarrassing is the outcome for the Delhi Chief Minister, and will he now change his attitude of hostility to the media? But first, Prime Minister Modi arrived in China earlier today amidst expectations that his visit could lead to forward movement on the 65-year-old border dispute. There have even been predictions of an out-of-the-box solution. But how realistic is all of this? With me to answer that question is India's former Foreign Secretary and an expert on China, Shyam Saran, who earlier this week wrote a thoughtful article for the new media portal The Wire on the whole issue of whether an out-of-box solution is possible or not. Shyam Saran, at the start of this year, when Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj visited Beijing, she said at a press conference about the border dispute, an out-of-the-box solution may still come on this issue. More recently, the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said to people in Delhi that he believed China was planning a surprise package when our Prime Minister visits that country. Would you accept that these comments have created a certain expectation of movement on the border issue?
Yes, there is no doubt that certain expectation has been created, but the issue is how realistic are those expectations given the ground realities?
Absolutely, and I'll come to those realities and I'll come to those expectations in a moment's time. But let me begin by talking to you a little about the different phases through which the India-China boundary negotiations have proceeded since their resumption in 1980. As you point out in your article in The Wire, the first phase was 1980 to 85, when China reiterated an offer first made in 1960. What was that offer of 1960?
This offer was really what came to be known as the package proposal. And the package proposal was put forward at a very high level of the Chinese leadership. Deng Xiaoping himself, who in 1982, on two separate occasions, one was in an interview given to the Indian journal, defense journal Vikrant, and the other was in a meeting that he had with the then chairman of the Policy Planning Committee, Mr. G. Parthasarthi. And in both these meetings, he said that, why should we not try and settle the boundary issue on the basis of a package whereby you retain what you have in the eastern sector, the so-called McMahon line, and we could make some minor concessions on the western sector, and this would be a fair deal. So the package proposal was in a sense reverting back to what had been on offer even in 1960 when Zhou Enlai had come to India. Basically to settle the boundary issue on the as-is and where-is basis, that is basically legitimizing the status quo. So this particular position continued up to 1985, when there was a very significant change.
So, but just a moment, before we go to 1985, let me, for the sake of the audience, ask you a question about why China wanted, in this 1960 offer reiterated in 1980, to keep all of Aksai Chin. And that's because it was critical to them because of the strategic road they were building connecting Xinjiang, a troublesome province for them, with Tibet. Is that right? Is that why they wanted to retain Aksai Chin?
No, but, the Aksai Chin was important, as you said, because of the road. But, the road had already been built in the 1950s itself. But the major development of infrastructure in Tibet and its connectivity with the rest of China, which is now a reality, was still not quite the case in the early 1980s. And therefore, still, I would say in the early 1980s, the Aksai Chin Road was still important, strategically important to China, in a manner that it is no longer true.
Now, in your article for The Wire, you write that there was a second stage after the offer made by Deng Xiaoping and before 1985, when a senior advisor of the then Chinese Prime Minister Zhao Ziyang had a word with our ambassador of the time in Beijing, A.P. Venkateswaran, and slightly amended the proposal to come up with something you call LAC+, whereby the status quo in the
Well,
eastern
the correct
sector...
position is that the correct position is that the LSC plus was actually something that very informally the Indian side had tried to explore. Because in those conversations, the offer still was the package proposal that Deng Xiaoping had put forward. And they were very keen at that time to have a visit by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. As you know, in 1983, she also became the chairman of the non-aligned movement. This coincided with a period in Chinese diplomacy where they were trying to take a more centrist position after having been seen as being very close to the United States of America and being very anti-Soviet. So they perhaps felt that reaching out to the non-aligned movement, reaching out to India would also be in keeping with that shift that we were beginning to see in Chinese diplomacy.
Now, for the
so when they said, when she comes, you know, we can settle on the basis of the package proposal. It is from our side we said, well, you know, just the package proposal or legitimization of the status quo will politically not sell.
Now, in fact,
so
just for the
if she
sake
has to come, there has to be something more.
Absolutely. Can I interrupt you again?
Yes.
For the sake of the audience, I want to clarify that the difference between what you call LAC Plus and the original package proposal was that they were prepared to make some undefined additional concessions on the West. I beg your pardon, on the East.
They said, what they asked was, if we were to make some concession in the Western sector and settle on that basis, would she come? That was, so in a sense, it was not really saying that, yes, we are prepared to settle on the basis of LSE plus, but there was a kind of an exploration of whether or not this was something which would enable a major, you know, upgradation of the bilateral relations between India and China.
Absolutely. Now, the situation altered, as your article points out, in 1985, when China reinterpreted the package proposal, reinterpreted the second stage, which you call LAC plus, now suggesting that India must make significant and meaningful concessions in the East, and in response, they would make undefined concessions in the West. Secondly, they also now began to insist that they must have Taiwan. This was clearly a moving backwards of the goalpost and a hardening of China's position compared to the stand they'd taken just a couple of years earlier and compared to the stand they'd taken as far back as 1960. Why was this hardening of their position happening in 1985?
Well, the only way I can explain it is, number one, because the Chinese economic reform and liberalization process had started significantly increasing China's economic capabilities, its military capabilities. The power gap in a sense between India and China was widening. There was also a sense that as far as the international situation was concerned, it was much more in China's favor. They had this close relationship with the United States. They had also started improving their relations with the then Soviet Union. As I mentioned, that there also in the meantime had been considerable development of the infrastructure in Tibet and the connectivity between Tibet and the rest of China. So perhaps, you know, the road through Aksai chain was perhaps not as important as it was before, and therefore, you know, to give up something what they consider significant in the East in order to retain this strategic you know, advantage may have, you know, that may have diminished.
And as you say in your article,
I think it was a combination of factors.
As you say in your article, the position taken in 1985 when they hardened their position has been basically the position they've kept since then. A quick answer to that before I move on.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Yes, that's basically true, yeah.
In which case, then, let me come to the key critical question. In these circumstances, what sort of out-of-box solution is credible and feasible? In your article, you appear to identify two possible potential out-of-box ideas. For the sake of the audience, can you explain what they are?
Well, what I pointed out was that, you know, it would be very difficult for India to concede Taiwan. You know, a territorial concession involving Taiwan is politically not possible. However, what is possible is that taking into account the religious sentiments of the people of Tibet, perhaps we can ease the access of Tibetan pilgrims to Tawang, just as China may also ease the travel of Indian pilgrims to Kailash Mansarovar, which is of great sacred significance to us. So, without really going into the question of sovereignty over Tawang, is there some way in which we can ease the access to what is a place of religious significance?
But that's essentially a confidence-building measure you're talking about. In your article, you actually set out two other possibilities. You're not advocating them, but you set out two possibilities. One of them, if I understand your article correctly, is a reversion to the original package proposal. The second, which you don't think is a very good idea, is to handle the border dispute a bit like the Sino-Russian or the Sino-Vietnamese ones, where the two sides took the disputed territory as a whole and then split it in some agreed proportion. You argue that that wouldn't work for India because the quantum of land that India would lose would be so large it would be politically unacceptable, particularly if China in addition wanted Tawang.
No, I was pointing to what kind of solutions have been found in respect to other border disputes that China has had with its neighbors. So it is true that both with the Russians as well as with the Vietnamese, the disputed territory, which was not very large in area, certainly not as large as the area in dispute between India and China, some kind of a division in percentage terms, in proportional terms, was reached. But I pointed out that this could not be a solution because of the very large area which is involved in the eastern sector. It is virtually the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. So even if you are talking about 20% or even 15% of this territory to be handed over, it still means a very large part of territory to be ceded. So that I do not think is politically
absolutely
acceptable.
Which means that, as your article suggests, and I'm virtually quoting your article now, the parameters within which a boundary settlement can be realistically sought if one is trying to seek one would be, as you put it, LAC plus on the one hand and the original package on the other, without Tawang being handed over. That's the parameters within which, if an out-of-box solution is to be found, it can be found. Is that right?
An out-of-box solution which I think, and this is my own judgment, I think may be politically saleable in India. So because I think just settling on the basis of the existing status quo may still be politically difficult for a leadership in India. But if there was some additional concession which was available in the western sector in addition, which is what is LSA plus, that perhaps would be something which would be acceptable on the Indian side. So now the question is whether or not this is something which is on offer from the Chinese side.
Absolutely.
As of now, I see no sign of that.
But for the sake of the audience, let me now explain what LAC plus is and get you to concur. LAC plus is basically a situation where the Chinese keep what they have in the West, which is Aksai Chin, but they make additional concessions which are so far unknown and unspecified to India in the West. And in addition, Tawang stays Indian. If that sort of LAC plus, as you put it, were to be on offer, and we don't know if it's on offer, but were it to be on offer, it would be at least theoretically politically acceptable in India.
That's my judgment. Of course, it is something that the political leadership would have to decide. But LSC plus basically means the current line of control, the current status quo, plus some additional territory which would be available to India in the western sector.
Now let me ask you this. We don't have any idea whether this is going to be offered by the Chinese. But what is the possibility or the likelihood or the chances that China could come around to make this sort of offer? I know they've made it in the past, but will they be prepared to now make it again?
Well, they might consider a bold move like that, provided the payoff is significant. What is it that is so important to China that it would be ready to consider such an offer? Frankly speaking, I do not see India being in a position to offer something so significant that China would be ready to make.
Can I ask you, what is the payoff?
Reality. So,
what is the payoff China would be looking for?
It's very difficult to say what the payoff China will be looking for, but as you know, there are issues that China has with India. There is the issue of Tibet and the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community resident in India. There are concerns which China has expressed about India's relationship with the United States, with Japan, with our activities in the in Southeast Asia. Whether or not these are issues which are part of the bargaining is very difficult to say. But frankly, at this point of time, given India's positions, long-standing positions, it would be very difficult for me to say that there could be on offer something so significant that China would really be willing to consider such an offer.
To put it the other way around, what you're saying is that whilst it's theoretically possible that were something like LAC plus to be offered, that could be politically acceptable in India, the problem is in return China would want something, and what they want would be very costly, perhaps too costly for India to consider giving. And so this remains therefore just a theoretical academic possibility at this moment. Am I right?
That's my judgment, yes.
Now tell me, one of the things that's happened today is that the Chinese television station CCTV has shown fairly prominently a map where POK is not part of India, it seems Aksai Chin is not part of India, Arunachal Pradesh is not part of India. Now CCTV is a government-controlled channel. Clearly this map could not have simply gone on air accidentally. It must have been authorized at some level. Is there a message that they are sending out by putting this sort of map on air the day Mr. Modi arrives in China?
But this map has been shown all the time consistently by China. It is not that it is something which is being just trotted out for this visit. This is China's official map. This is the map that they use in all their official publications. So I don't think we should read so much into it. After all, if they are going to show a map on their television screens, I would imagine that they would show the map that they believe is the official status of the territories. With regard to POK, they have shown Kashmir as a disputed territory in most of their maps. So while we should be, of course, not very happy about such a map being shown during the time of the visit, but the map itself is something that they have consistently shown also in the past.
So two quick follow-up questions. The furor that has broken out on social media about this map misunderstands the fact or overlooks the fact that this is the map that China has been showing in the past. This is the map by which China stands, and therefore it's only to be expected, even if we don't like it, that this is the map they'll put on their TV. The furor on social media doesn't take that into account.
Well, we oppose such a depiction of India and its territories, but we also, on our maps, show our territories as we believe is a part of Indian territory. So, in formal terms, we have to stand by what our official claim is.
And the second quick follow-up question, will this map cast any shadow over the visit that began this morning?
Sure.
Is that likely to be the case? Will this map cast a shadow over the visit?
I hope not. I see no reason why it should overshadow the visit, because as I said, this is something which would appear in any official Chinese publication, and if they have brought this out as part of the a television program, then I mean, we can, as I said, we can we can take exception to the fact that this has been brought out at a time when this visit is taking place, but I don't think we should make such a big deal about it.
My last question, does this map in any way affect the very small possibility that there could be movement on the border? Is this map a suggestion that in fact we shouldn't be looking for movement on the border, or are the two utterly unrelated and the prospects of movement on the border issue are not at all affected by this map?
Well, I think it is very clear that at this particular point of time, China stands by its territorial claims, just as India stands by its territorial claims. So and therefore, only confidence-building measures at the border are possible at this stage.
And the map doesn't change anything materially at all?
I do not think so.
Shyam Saran, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for explaining your thinking on the likelihood, possibility, and what shape there could be to any theoretical out-of-box solution, and how you added that at the moment it's unlikely to be offered because in return the cost the Chinese will want may be far too high for India to agree to. That, I think, substantially answers the enormous curiosity that is there about whether there is a possible out-of-box solution, how likely it is, and of course how acceptable it is. Time for a break.